Okay, to continue our human story, about 6,000 years ago, a group of yak herders, they also herded cows and sheep, in what is now the steppes of the Ukraine, had the curious idea of consuming the fluid from the mammary glands of their lactating animals. They were consuming milk, yak milk, and indeed sheep's milk and cow's milk. And these peoples migrated northwest. They became the Anglo-Saxons, the Scandinavians, the Germans, and by about 2,000 years ago, these peoples had put the production of dairy onto a major scale. And we kind of live in a world here where we are in a bit of a bubble where we think it's quite normal to be consuming dairy products, to be consuming the fluid from the mammary glands of cows, for example. But we're actually in a small minority. The vast majority of the world's population traditionally never consumed dairy, except for a few isolated circumstances like the Maasai in Africa. And not only do they think it a bizarre thing to be doing or vaguely grotesque, it makes them ill. After all, how many of you think this is a normal thing to be doing? All right, it's a frivolous way of trying to make a point. Foragers weren't creeping around under female antelopes trying to suckle their teats. It never happened. And just to try and put this into context, the milk of the species is for the young of the species. Cow's milk isn't even good for grown-up cows. I like to put it this way, that a newborn mammal is really born prematurely. It's still a fetus. And milk is fetus food that takes it through to the point where it then becomes a fully functioning, biologically complete creature. Babies, human babies, cows, baby cows, have different biologies, different biochemistries, different enzymes, different ways of dealing with the food that it's getting, which is mainly the milk of its mother. Why are we putting cows' fetus food into our own children or into our own bodies? All right, it's a kind of provocative way of trying to set the scene. After all, when I was a kid, we used to look out for the milk that had the cream on the top. We thought that was the best bit. And then, long time ago, back in the 60s, the nutritionists came along and said, well, actually, that's saturated fat. It's not very good for us. We should be having skimmed milk. So they take the fat out of the milk. They turn it into butter, they turn it into ice cream, they recycle it. We eat it all the same, just in a different form. So we know that there's something wrong with milk right away. And then more recently, people come along and said, yeah, there's a problem with the lactose in milk. We're lactose intolerant. It gives people migraines. We come out in rashes. It gives them allergies. It gives them joint pains and so forth. Better off if you've got lactose-free milk too. We're beginning to wonder why we're bothering. Milk also has proteins like casein and lactalbumin, which are highly allergenic and which are high cholesterol raisers. There's another reason why we tend to have high cholesterol levels if we're eating dairy products. We know that consumption of dairy is a factor in a whole range of diseases. In cancers, it's a factor in cancers, it's a factor in heart disease, in osteoporosis, in cholesterol, which we talked about, allergies, migraine, irritable bowel, ADHD, and arthritis. The bottom line on dairy is that there isn't anybody on this planet who wouldn't be better off never consuming it. If you can remember, think through that triple negative, it means don't consume dairy. And we include milk, the yogurts we've talked about for various reasons. Quite apart from this mischief they're doing, they're also giving us a nasty insulin reaction. And the cheeses. I'm married to a French woman, and I fought her for a long time over cheeses. So I said, look, okay, from time to time, a nice piece of ripe camembert with a nice glass of red wine, not a big deal. And it's the camembert that's the problem, not the red wine. Okay, so what is left after we've taken all these things away? Well, I like to talk about, I like to use the pyramid that used to happen because I think it actually illustrates it a lot better. And down at the bottom, instead of all the pastas and the breads and things that the authorities would have us eating, we would have low-starch raw plant food, and that's easily done. That is nice big salads every day. And this is just shows you the components of a salad, plus a bit of mackerel thrown on the top. That's the kind of thing. Large volumes. Yes, we're talking about large volumes of plant food. We're talking about low-starch vegetables, so it's pretty much everything which isn't a potato. And go a little perhaps easier on the carrots. They're a little bit glycemic. But otherwise, and peas. Peas, legumes too, double whammy there. And then we go to low glycemic fruits, and we've kind of touched on some of the ones, the pineapples and so on, which are rather glycemic. You need to go a little easy on those, but the berries are a fairly safe option, and well, just a little bit of grapefruit's fine too, and a little bit of nectarine, for example. I mean, this is the kind of volumes you might be eating in a day. You don't eat it all in one go. You can eat it through the day, for example, but it's the kind of thing you're looking at. And then we're talking about the good proteins, and we haven't talked much about this so far, but yes, we are looking at seafood of any kind, particularly the oily fish, gets the fish oils, that's always good. There's a bit of salmon there. Omega-3 rich eggs, if you can get them from, where I live in Cyprus, I can get village eggs. They come from the farm where the chickens are running around and they're pecking at everything, and they're eating little insects, they're eating purslane and all these kinds of good things. They have very good quality eggs, but otherwise get them from a supermarket. Marks and Spencer's got a good range of free-range eggs, which are omega-3 rich. They do it by feeding the chickens flaxseed, which is good enough. Poultry of most kinds, this is roast duck, but most poultry of all kinds except for battery chickens really have a terrible fatty acid profile. Better off with the duck and with goose, which are better still. If you can get wild game, if you can get the partridge and the pheasant, that's even better. And then we're talking about some of the more exotic creatures, venison, bison, ostrich, alligator, whatever, those kinds of things. When I was talking in Wyoming, I had it's cow country, all these ranchers. They were there with their Stetsons on, and they really did have the boots. And I got to the point where I was talking like this, talking about beef not being such a great thing to be eating. But the cowpoke said, well, what about beef? What do you say about it? And I was kind of saying, well, it's not such a great thing to be doing. I came, as I was driving to the lecture hall through the countryside of Wyoming, I saw moose standing at the side of the road, elk at the side of the road. There were deer at the side of the road. I said, those would be fine. They said, well, that's great, because our freezers are full of elk, moose, and venison. All the beef, we ship it off to Chicago and New York. We don't care what happens to the guys there. We don't care what happens to the guys there. But yes, these are the exotic meats. You don't have to necessarily go for them, but just know that they're on the list. And beef, lamb and pork would be all right, and will be all right perhaps in some future when they've been bred to have the right fatty acid profile and they're fed in the right kind of way so that their fatty acid profile is the right kind of one. But at the moment, all we can say is, yeah, we've got to go a little easier, particularly on the pork fats, the really dangerous ones, as we've just seen. And then there are nuts of various kinds, tree nuts, not peanuts, but tree nuts of various kinds. Basically, they're all fine. And things you make from it. For example, we can make a nice almond bread from it using UGG products. Or we can make a nice fruit and seed cake from it. And these are high-protein foods. I call them high-protein foods. Or indeed a nice ring marble cake too, for example, using the sorts of products that Kim is here very cleverly, ingeniously putting together for us. And then finally we talked about the good oils and the bad oils and that kind of thing, and occasional lapses. It's your birthday or something like that. You can let things go a little bit. Right, now I want to talk very briefly about stress. Stress was out there on the savannas, of course. They had stressful things happening to them. And our brains were designed to handle this kind of stress. The trouble is today we're triggering our stress reactions far more frequently, far more intensely than our brains were ever designed to handle properly. And I just want to give you a few examples just to set the scene where we can sometimes take a little bit of control for ourselves, because we kind of caught up in this machine where we've kind of lose control of our time, of what's going on with ourselves, and we are stressed in all kinds of ways. And if we can try and get control of it, then that would be a great thing to do. I come from, or I live in a country which has got this great history of ancient Greek myths. And what I like about the ancient Greeks is that they kind of had these legends which encapsulate the human condition. And one of these legends concerned a psychopathic innkeeper called Procrustes. Does this mean anything to you? Doesn't matter, I'll tell you. Procrustes had his inn on a lonely road up in the mountains above Athens, and travellers would come, knock on the door and say, "Have you got a bed for the night?" And Procrustes would say, "Sure, come on in, lie on the bed and see if you like it." And the unsuspecting traveller would lie down on the bed, and if he was too short, Procrustes would stretch him to fit the bed, and if he was too long, he would chop his feet off so that he fitted the bed. And this has become a metaphor for artificially trying to squeeze something into a preconceived paradigm. And Aldous Huxley used this metaphor in his book Brave New World, where he said, science, and this is back in the 1930s, so we're talking about 80 years ago, science and technology is creating a Procrustean bed for mankind to lie on. And if mankind doesn't fit, it's just too bad for mankind. There'll have to be some stretchings and amputations. And that is what is happening to us today. We're in this kind of machine where we're having to fit the machine, whereas the machine should be fitting us. So when we realise that we're in this paradigm, then we can start to think a bit more carefully about how we handle that. And I'll just cite a couple of examples. One of the things that is unusual but not unique about the human species is that there is indeed a grandmother generation. Seemingly that grandparents, and in particular grandmothers, were vital to the survival of the human species. It's the same with chimpanzees and gorillas, and even killer whales. They too have grandmother generations, but not many species do. Now, what we see, why would grandmothers in particular be important? Well, when we look at the forager lifestyle, we see that grandmothers in particular are vital to provisioning and looking after the smaller children. They help feed them, they actually find the food for the children, and for the rest of the family, and they look after the younger children too in a big way. And seemingly this is so vital that it's programmed into grandmothers' brains. And I see it all the time. Places like in retirement areas like Cyprus, or where I was in Palm Springs when I'm in Southern California, a big retirement area, you find that the grandmothers in particular yearning to be back with the grandchildren, but they've retired 2,000 miles away from them. The grandfathers aren't so bothered, they're out on the golf course, they're all right. Here we have, this is a Hadza woman, she's a grandmother, she's in her 80s, she's carrying the baby on her back, her grandchild, and she's got a tuber in her hand which she's just dug up. She's a typical person who is vital, if you like, to the survival of the human species. Now the thing is, you might say it's a good idea to retire to the sunshine and the palm trees, but the downside is that you probably never thought of, is that by so doing you might be, and probably are, creating 3 sets of stressed out people. You've got the grandparents are stressed out because the grandmother's stressed out and wanting to keep getting back to the grandchildren. You've got the parents stressed out because they've become 24-hour parenting machines. They haven't got the grandmother helping. And the children are stressed out because the parents are stressed out. So there you can start to think about these sorts of things and weigh those questions, for example. More than that, when we're thinking about child rearing, and in particular thinking about social interactions, the forager band was almost a unit by itself of the 40 or 50 people. But if you had a family of the father, the mother, the grandmother and the children would be kind of in the nucleus of it, The mother, grandmother and children were perhaps closer together than the father, but they were all part of a network where everybody kind of looked after each other. And in particular, every single adult of the band would feel some responsibility to the other children in the band, whether or not they were their own. It's what is known as alloparenting. In other words, they dilute the stress of actually looking after the children amongst many people. They don't have such intense relationships amongst each other, particularly within the family itself. And today, we've got what we call a nuclear family, where the father, mother, child 1 and child 2, I've got them jokingly set inside an iron cage, but they're kind of in a box. And they are very intense relationships with each other, stressful relationships, and rather weak relationships out to other parts of the world where they're probably all separate, where the children have got their own school chums, where the mother and got her workplace and her chums for somewhere else, the father ditto. And Granny is floating off somewhere in the distance and maybe or has or does not have links into the children. The nuclear family, believe it or not, is not the ideal situation. The extended family is. The extended family is. Next thing is the workplace. When we're talking about work for these people, for foragers, what was it? The only work they had was finding food, foraging, hunting, whatever. On average, the women spent 4 to 5 hours a day doing it, and the men, about the same thing. Overall, during a week, they might work 15 to 20 hours total. That's half what we work today. We work too much. But more than that, the work was fulfilling. The women, when they were working to collect the berries and forage and everything with their children on their backs, they had the children with them, they felt good about what they were doing. The men, when they were out there, going off and being brave and ingenious and setting traps and everything, and come back proudly with it, they were getting something fulfilling. Most people today have work which is not fulfilling at all. Perhaps most people listening to me here do, but the average don't. But more importantly than anything else, these people were in control of their livelihoods. That is to say, they didn't have to hustle for jobs. They didn't have to worry about getting a job, or keeping their job, or climbing a career ladder. You wanted to feed your family, you just got off, walked into the bush and started foraging, and came back and fed them. Nobody to stop them, nobody to ask for you. They were in charge of their livelihoods. Today, it's a chronic, subliminal stress the whole time. The fact is that we are not in control of our livelihoods. But what we do find is that people who are more in control of their livelihoods actually are much better adjusted, mentally adjusted. Sometimes it just means working for yourself. It has its stresses, of course, but nevertheless, being in control actually can give you much more, make you much better adjusted. And the interesting thing is that when they study communities which have a higher percentage of small businesses, people who work for themselves, that the whole community is actually better adjusted. The whole community is better adjusted too. And the worst adjusted people who live in places where you've got these big organisations, soulless really, and where people are doing meaningless tasks. So, there's messages here, multiple messages here about how you manage your work experience and how you earn your living. It's not easy because we're in this machine where we're kind of on this conveyor belt, like Charlie Chaplin, having to screw up all the nuts all the time, and you don't almost stop because you lose your place and then you've got to catch up again. But this kind of gives you a bit of an idea of how we are living in a very stressful environment, and we kind of accept it and don't fight against it. Right, so let me just kind of wrap up a little bit on what we've been talking about. The 7 things to avoid. So yes, the starches and the sugars, the being overweight. Trust me, if you do what we're talking about, you're not going to be overweight. Omega-6 oils overconsumption. Dairy, avoid the dairies, avoid the bad animal fats, avoid salt as best you can, and avoid the dysfunctional lifestyle as best you can. Go and live with the sunshine and palm trees, provided you're not leaving the grandchildren behind. And the 6 factors to focus on. yeah, sunlight, do need the sunshine. The physical activity of that particular kind doesn't have to be highly stressful or high endurance stuff. High volume of plant intake, colon health, high intake of micronutrients, the savannah model proteins that we've talked about, which is pretty much everything except the lamb, beef and pork, and the mental health choices, which is to do with social connections and also living in an environment which is pleasing, which makes you feel good. Cityscapes, concrete jungles just are inhuman. They're not, again, this is not easy always to organise, but this is a vital part of being healthy. So I'm just going to wrap up now with just a few thoughts. What I've talked about might seem very daunting, but I sometimes talk about the 80-15-5 rule. If 80% of what you do is spot on, then 15% can be a little off, and 5%, well, it can be the lapses. It's your birthday, it's Christmas, or something like that. But if you are fighting a fatal disease, or potentially fatal disease, a cancer or your heart disease, then you've got to decide who's going to win, the disease or you. In which case, you might decide to just go cold turkey. And I've got plenty of clients who've decided for themselves, yeah, I just go cold turkey. Don't give it any quarter. Secondly, when we're talking about the major diseases today, the cancers, the heart disease, the diabetes and all the rest of it, there's never going to be a magic bullet like that penicillin shot that fixed my septicemia, my blood disease. There's never going to be a magic bullet like that. It's because there's all these different factors all going wrong at the same time. But you don't have to micromanage it. That's the good point. You just put this body into the situation which it recognises and it sorts itself out just fine. And thirdly, we often make the mistake of thinking of our bodies as though they were a machine, where if something goes wrong, then we must go in with spanners and screwdrivers and change spare parts and fiddle around with it. That does it a tremendous injustice. The body is a vibrant, living, throbbing organism with terrific powers of self-repair. Our main challenge is to stop sabotaging its ability to repair itself. So the main message is, though, that you have to take control. Nobody else is going to do this for you. You have to take control and just go out and do it. And oh yes, you can. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you.